Something is moving in the sky above you right now. Not wind, not clouds, but something almost as old as both. If you look closely enough at a bird, really look, something ancient stares back. They are everywhere. They are constant. They have been here so long that we stopped seeing them. We have given them names: robin, heron, hawk, swift. We have built our mornings around the sound of them. But we have never really asked the most extraordinary question of all. What if they are not descended from dinosaurs? What if they are? Dinosaurs. What if the dinosaurs never actually left? 66 million years ago, something fell out of the sky and changed this planet forever. What happened next is a story we are only now beginning to understand. We know what dinosaurs looked like, or we think we do. The image is fixed in almost everyone who grew up after 1993. Giant, scaled, cold-eyed, prehistoric. And then there is this. Modern biology and paleontology now agree on something that would have seemed absurd to the naturalists of the 19th century. Birds are not like dinosaurs. Birds are not related to dinosaurs. Birds are dinosaurs. Technically, taxonomically, evolutionarily. That means there are roughly 11,000 living species of dinosaur on this planet right now. They are in your garden. They are nesting in your eaves. They even woke you up this morning. How did this happen? How did the largest animals to ever walk this earth become the creatures we scatter bread for in the park? That is the question this film intends to answer. The science of paleontology was born in the early 19th century, and almost from the beginning, its practitioners were arguing. In 1861, in a limestone quarry in Bavaria, Germany, a quarry worker split open a block of ancient rock and found something that had no name yet. It had wings, it had feathers, and it had teeth. The creature was named Archaeopteryx, ancient wing. It was 150 million years old, and it immediately divided the scientific world. Was it a bird? Was it a dinosaur? Was it something in between? A British biologist named Thomas Henry Huxley was among the first to look at it carefully and say, it might be both. In 1868, he published the argument that birds were directly descended from small theropod dinosaurs. Almost no one believed him. Huxley pointed to Compsognathus, a small, swift, bipedal dinosaur found in the same Bavarian limestone beds as Archaeopteryx, and argued that the structural similarities were too great to be coincidence. The hollow bones, the wishbone, the three-toed feet. The jury was unconvinced. For the next century, the idea quietly gathered dust. In 1964, an American paleontologist named John Ostrom was excavating in Montana when he found a dinosaur that changed his thinking permanently. It was a raptor, a fast, agile, two-legged predator with a large curved killing claw. He named it Deinonychus, and the more he studied it, the more it reminded him not of a lizard, but of a bird. Ostrom spent years quietly reviving Huxley's argument. He published papers. He compared anatomies. He tracked down every structural parallel between Deinonychus and modern birds that he could find. By the early 1970s, a movement was forming. Scientists were starting to call it the dinosaur renaissance. The idea that birds were dinosaurs was no longer fringe science. It was becoming a hypothesis that demanded a proper test. But science does not change on argument alone. It changes on evidence. And in 1996, the evidence arrived. For much of the 20th century, dinosaurs were understood as essentially large lizards, slow, cold-blooded, dim, dragging their tails through Mesozoic mud. The image came partly from anatomy, partly from assumption, and partly from the company they kept in the textbooks, alongside crocodilians and ancient reptiles. The cold-blooded reptile model was intellectually tidy. It explained why dinosaurs went extinct. They were too slow, too dependent on warmth, too rigid to survive a sudden climate shift. It also made them feel safely prehistoric, safely other, safely gone. The popular image of Velociraptor in 1993 was a 6-foot scaled predator, intelligent, terrifying, reptilian through and through. It was one of the most influential depictions of a dinosaur in history. It was also, as it turned out, deeply wrong in ways that made scientists slightly uncomfortable afterward. The problem was Archaeopteryx. It kept refusing to fit either category cleanly. It had feathers, it had wings, but it also had teeth, clawed hands, and a long bony tail. For over a century, paleontologists argued about whether it was a very advanced dinosaur or a very primitive bird. The debate was real. The answer, when it came, was that it was both, because both categories described the same lineage. The false answer was comfortable. The true answer required something harder. It required that we look at the birds we had always known and see something entirely different in them. In August 1996, a Chinese farmer and part-time fossil hunter named Li Yumin was prospecting in Liaoning province in northeastern China, a region already known for exceptional fossil preservation. He uncovered a specimen unlike anything he had seen before. The slab split into two halves. He sold each half to a different museum. Canadian paleontologist Phil Curry saw a photograph of that fossil at a Beijing museum in October 1996. He later described seeing it as being, in his words, bowled over. What he was looking at was a small theropod dinosaur, not a bird by any accepted classification, covered in a coat of fine fur-like filamentous structures along its back and tail. Proto-feathers on a dinosaur, definitively. Curry brought a photograph to the annual Society of Vertebrate Paleontology meeting in New York that October. The crowds that gathered were, by accounts, extraordinary. John Ostrom, the man who had spent decades quietly arguing that birds were dinosaur descendants, reportedly stood in stunned silence. Everything he had argued for was standing in front of him in a slab of Chinese rock. The Liaoning beds, it turned out, were not merely a single discovery. They were a window. In the years that followed, paleontologists pulled species after species from the Yixian Formation, each one adding a new piece to a picture that was rapidly becoming undeniable. Caudipteryx, tail feather, was a dinosaur the size of a turkey, with a magnificent fan of symmetrical plumes at its tail and small wing stubs covered in feathers it could not use for flight. The feathers clearly predated flight. They were doing something else entirely. In 2007, a team at the American Museum of Natural History examined a velociraptor forearm fossil collected in Mongolia in 1998. On the posterior edge of the ulna, the forearm bone, they found 6 distinct bumps, evenly spaced, quill knobs. The same structures found in modern birds that anchor large secondary feathers. Velociraptor had been feathered. The animal from Jurassic Park had looked nothing like the real thing. The real velociraptor was roughly the size of a turkey. It weighed about 30 pounds. Its arms were shorter than a modern bird's wings and were covered in large secondary feathers it could not use for flight. It had scales on its legs like a modern bird. It had a wishbone. It almost certainly nested and brooded eggs. It was, in a meaningful biological sense, a bird that could not fly. Anchiornis, named for John Ostrom's work, meaning near bird, was found with its feather pigment partially preserved. Using the microscopic structures of melanosomes inside the fossil, researchers rebuilt its coloring, black and white on the wings, rufous red on the head. A living portrait of something 160 million years old. We know what it looked like in the sun. By the early 2000s, the question was no longer whether dinosaurs had feathers. The question had shifted entirely. The question was now, when did feathers begin? And why? To understand what birds are, you need to understand what dinosaurs were. Dinosauria is a clade, a complete evolutionary group that includes an ancestor and all of its descendants. It divides early into 2 great lineages. One leads to the horned, armored, and plated dinosaurs. The other leads to the sauropods and to the theropods, the 2-legged predators. Birds live within the theropods, nested inside a group called Maniraptora. They did not descend from dinosaurs. They are dinosaurs the way humans are primates. Feathers did not evolve for flight. That is one of the most important things the Liaoning fossils established. The earliest feathered dinosaurs could not fly. Their feathers were simple, more like filaments, like fur made of keratin. They were almost certainly for insulation. Dinosaurs, it turns out, were far more likely to have been warm-blooded than the cold-blooded reptile model ever allowed. Feathers evolved in stages that paleontologists can now trace through the fossil record. The earliest stage was a simple hollow tube, a proto-feather. From there, barbs began to branch. Then those barbs acquired interlocking hooks, creating the tight woven surface of a modern feather. The asymmetric shape of flight feathers, wider on the leading edge, evolved last. Flight was not the reason feathers existed. Flight was what feathers eventually made possible. Flight itself, when it came, was a revolution. The hollow bones that theropods had carried for millions of years became part of a breathing system, air sacs that run through the skeleton, making respiration more efficient than anything a mammal can manage. The wishbone stores and releases elastic energy with every wing beat. The feathers generate both lift and thrust simultaneously. Birds are not primitive flyers. They are arguably the most aerodynamically sophisticated animals that have ever existed. The structural evidence is impossible to ignore once you start looking. The wishbone, the furcula, exists in both T-Rex and in every modern bird. The hollow, air-filled bones are shared. The three-toed foot with its backward-facing hallux is shared. The way bird embryos develop their feet is so similar to the way theropod dinosaurs grew their feet that developmental biologists can trigger dormant genetic pathways in modern chicken embryos and produce something that looks startlingly like a small dinosaur limb. In 2016, researchers at Harvard and Yale published work showing that by altering a single developmental gene pathway, they could grow chicken embryos with snouts that look more like dinosaur snouts than bird beaks. No genetic engineering, no inserted genes. They simply switched off a developmental shortcut that birds had evolved. Underneath modern bird anatomy, the dinosaur blueprint is still running. Nesting behavior links the living and the extinct in ways that feel almost personal. Oviraptor, long suspected of egg theft, its name meaning egg thief, was eventually found sitting on its own nest in a brooding posture identical to modern birds. Arms spread low over the clutch, protecting, waiting. The parental behavior that we associate with birds runs deep. Consider the penguin. It cannot fly. Its wings are flippers. It moves on land with a kind of cheerful difficulty, and yet it is fully a bird. Its skeleton, its feathers, its warm blood, its breeding behavior all connect it to every other bird in the world, and through those connections to the theropod dinosaurs of the Mesozoic. A penguin standing in an Antarctic blizzard is a living fossil carrying 230 million years of evolutionary history in its bones. The cassowary is the closest thing to looking a dinosaur in the eye that most of us will ever experience. It stands nearly 6 feet tall. It has a hollow, bony casque on its head whose function we still do not fully understand. Its inner toe carries a 4-inch dagger-like claw. It has been documented disemboweling large animals in a single kick. It is by any measure one of the most dangerous birds alive, and it is also by any scientific measure a dinosaur. The V formation that migrating geese fly is not random. It is aerodynamic precision. Each bird after the lead exploits the upwash from the bird ahead, reducing drag by up to 65%, according to research published in the journal Nature. They rotate the lead position to share the work. This is complex coordinated behavior that required a brain, millions of years of selection, and a physiology purpose-built for sustained long-distance flight. New Caledonian crows manufacture and use tools. They shape hooks from wire or plant material, use them to extract food from cavities, and carry their tools from one foraging site to another. Research shows they can solve multi-step problems and appear to plan ahead. This is the same cognitive architecture, expanded forebrain, social learning, extended juvenile period, that we once assumed was exclusive to mammals. It evolved independently in a dinosaur lineage 66 million years after the asteroid. When the first humans arrived in New Zealand 700 years ago, they found a land ruled by birds. There were no native land mammals. The ecological roles that mammals filled on other continents, large grazers, apex predators, small scavengers, had all been taken by birds. The moa reached nearly 12 feet tall and weighed half a ton. The Haast's eagle, which hunted it, had a wingspan of 10 feet and was the apex predator of an entire island ecosystem. They were gone within a century of human arrival. The feather is among the most complex structures in nature. A single flight feather from a large bird may contain 1 million interlocking barbs and barbules, each one precisely shaped, each one capable of being re-zipped after disruption, which is why birds spend so much time preening. Every feather is a small miracle of biological engineering, and that engineering traces back without interruption to the Jurassic era. Here is the complication. We know that birds are dinosaurs. We know that with high confidence. What we do not know, what is genuinely, actively contested, is which specific dinosaur gave rise to the bird lineage, and exactly when. Microraptor was a dinosaur with flight feathers on all 4 limbs. It could glide at minimum and possibly had a kind of biplane flight mode. It complicated the neat tree-to-ground-to-sky narrative of bird evolution. If flight began in trees, gliding down, why do so many early feathered dinosaurs appear to have been ground runners first? Yi Qi, meaning strange wing in Mandarin, was a dinosaur from the Jurassic that had evolved a completely different solution to flight. Membrane wings like a bat stretched over an elongated wrist bone. It had nothing to do with the bird lineage. It was flight evolving independently, in a completely different architecture. Evolution, it seems, was experimenting. The asteroid hit. That much is settled. 66 million years ago, an object approximately 12 kilometers across struck the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico with an energy equivalent to billions of nuclear weapons. The Cretaceous ended in fire and winter. The non-avian dinosaurs, every lineage that was not on the bird branch of the family tree, disappeared from the fossil record within a geologically instant time frame. What survived was something small, something that could shelter underground or in tree hollows, something that could eat seeds when insects and fruit were gone, something with a metabolism fast enough to keep warm through the long impact winter. The birds that survived the end of the Cretaceous were not the ones we would recognize today. They were the raw material from which every modern bird would eventually be carved. Science requires that we be honest about the boundaries of what we know, and in the dinosaur-bird transition, there are real and important boundaries. The exact position of Archaeopteryx on the dinosaur-bird family tree has been revised multiple times since the 1990s. In 2011, a Chinese fossil called Xiaotingia appeared to push Archaeopteryx out of the bird lineage entirely into a more distant theropod group. Subsequent studies pushed it back. This is not scientific failure. This is science working as intended. Each new specimen tests and refines the model. The color reconstructions we have for Anchiornis, for Sinosauropteryx, for several other feathered dinosaurs are based on preserved melanosomes, pigment-carrying structures inside fossilized feather cells. The black, white, and rufous red we assign to Anchiornis carries genuine scientific confidence. But melanosomes capture only the colors produced by melanin. Any colors produced by carotenoids, the brilliant blues, greens, and yellows of many modern birds, would not be preserved. We do not know what colors those animals showed to each other. We do not know exactly when the first true flight evolved. We do not know whether it evolved once or multiple times. We do not know whether the transition from ground runner to flyer went through the trees or directly from the ground. The honest answer is that we have strong hypotheses, excellent fossil evidence for multiple stages, and genuine unresolved debate about the sequence. Uncertainty is not a gap in the story. It is where the story is still being written. Every year, new specimens arrive from China, from Mongolia, from Patagonia, from Morocco. Each one shifts the model slightly. The picture has never been clearer, and there has never been more left to find. The first major debate is about the origin of flight itself. The ground-up hypothesis argues that flight evolved from the ground up, that fast-running theropods, leaping and flapping, gradually gained enough lift to become airborne. The aerodynamic forces required to generate lift from the ground are significant, but a running start dramatically reduces the velocity needed. The trees-down hypothesis argues the opposite, that small dinosaurs climbed into trees and developed flight by gliding downward, exploiting gravity rather than fighting it. This requires that early bird ancestors were at least partially arboreal, which some fossils suggest and others contradict. Microraptor and Yi Chi both support the idea that early Paravians were experimenting with gliding from elevated positions. The current position in the field is that the ground-up and trees-down hypotheses are not mutually exclusive. Some lineages may have approached flight from different starting points. The wing-assisted incline running hypothesis, WARE, suggests that the flapping of feathered arms helped protobirds run up steep slopes, with full flight emerging as a natural extension of that capacity. All three mechanisms may have been paths through which different lineages approached the same destination. Evolution does not take a single road. The remarkable thing about flight is not that it evolved once, but that it evolved at all. And then evolved again in bats, and again in pterosaurs, and something like it in flying squirrels and flying fish. Life, when it finds a useful solution, tends to find it repeatedly. Whatever the mechanism, something crossed the boundary. In the dark rock below the line, the world of the non-avian dinosaurs, extraordinary and gone. In the lighter rock above it, the world that followed. And moving through that line, alive when everything else died, was a small feathered animal carrying the entire future of its lineage in its genes. Dinosaurs first appeared approximately 230 million years ago. They persisted as non-avian dinosaurs for 165 million years. The bird lineage has been continuous for at least 150 million years and counting. For context, our own genus, Homo, has existed for roughly 2 to 3 million years. The entire span of human civilization occupies the last 10,000. Dinosaurs have been on this planet for 23,000 times longer than civilization has existed. 10,000 years ago, when the first human settlements were forming in the Fertile Crescent, birds had already been birds for 140 million years. They were already diverse, already distributed across every continent, already filling every ecological niche from deep forest to open ocean. We arrived in a world they had already shaped. During the age of the non-avian dinosaurs, the continents were still assembling themselves into the shapes we recognize. The Atlantic was young. India was an island drifting northward. The Tethys Sea, an ancient ocean that no longer exists, separated what would become Europe from what would become Africa. Birds evolved in a world that looked nothing like this one and adapted as the world changed beneath them. The Arctic tern travels farther in a single year than any other animal on Earth. It breeds in the Arctic summer and winters in the Antarctic, a round trip of up to 70,000 kilometers. Over a lifetime, a single tern may cover 3 million kilometers. It does this year after year, navigating by stars, sun, and magnetic field, with a brain the size of a walnut. Evolution has been refining that navigation system for at least 50 million years. There are roughly 11,000 species of bird alive today. There are estimated to be between 200 billion and 400 billion individual birds on this planet at any given time. By sheer number, birds are the most abundant vertebrate animals on Earth. They are the living legacy of the most successful lineage in the history of vertebrate life. What birds tell us about extinction is as important as what they tell us about survival. The mass extinction event 66 million years ago killed somewhere between 75 and 80% of all species on Earth. The recovery took millions of years. The birds that survived did so because they were small, metabolically flexible, and capable of moving to find food and shelter. Size was a death sentence. Flexibility was survival. After the asteroid, the birds that survived underwent what evolutionary biologists call adaptive radiation, an explosion of diversification as species rapidly filled the ecological space left by the vanished non-avian dinosaurs. Within 10 million years, the basic shape of modern bird diversity was in place. From a handful of survivors, the lineage produced hummingbirds, ostriches, owls, albatrosses, penguins, and parrots. The asteroid didn't end the dinosaurs. It liberated a branch of them. Birds and humans have coexisted in ways that are deeply entangled. Swallows build nests in our buildings. Crows raid our waste. Eagles nest on our bridges. But the relationship runs deeper than proximity. Birds have shaped human culture, religion, navigation, and science for as long as we have existed. The instinct to watch them, to name them, to follow their migrations. That instinct may be one of the oldest things we carry. Birds are also our most sensitive indicator of ecosystem health. The populations of monitored bird species have fallen by nearly 3 billion individuals in North America alone since 1970, a 29% decline in roughly 50 years. The causes are intertwined: habitat loss, pesticide use, outdoor cats, glass collisions, light pollution disrupting migration. When bird populations collapse, the ecosystems they support, seed dispersal, insect control, nutrient cycling, collapse with them. The arithmetic is sobering. Approximately 1 billion birds die from window collisions in the United States each year. Between 1 and 4 billion die from outdoor cat predation. These are not abstract statistics. They represent the ongoing loss of something that took hundreds of millions of years to build. The complexity of bird communication continues to reveal itself with every year of study. Some species have been documented using syntax, combining calls in patterns that change meaning in ways that mirror fundamental properties of human language. We are not the only animals on this planet with complex language. We may have simply been the last to notice it. Every autumn, billions of birds navigate by the stars. Species that have never migrated before find their way across oceans and continents on their first attempt, guided by a magnetic sense we still do not fully understand, carrying star maps encoded in their genes. We have been on this planet for 2 to 3 million years. Birds have been navigating it for at least 150 million. They know it in ways we do not. There is a moment that almost every person has experienced and almost no one thinks much about. A bird lands nearby and stays. And for a few seconds, something in us goes very quiet, and we watch. Xu Xing, the Chinese paleontologist who has named more dinosaur species than any living person, once described the experience of looking at the Liaoning fossils as looking through a window into time that should not exist. The preservation is so precise that you can see the individual filaments. You can see where the feathers are attached. You can see the last meal in the stomach. The boundary between the living and the extinct becomes thin in a way that is genuinely disorienting. The ornithologist Leander Lynn Haupt wrote that learning to identify birds by sound is one of the most quietly radical things a person can do, because once you can hear them, the world is never quiet again. You realize you have been living inside a constant avian conversation that you never had the vocabulary for. The forest is not silent, it is talking. It has been talking for 150 million years. The people who study birds, the field ornithologists, the fossil preparators, the developmental biologists who grow embryos to test genetic hypotheses, share something. Not certainty, but a kind of reverence. The subject keeps getting stranger. It keeps insisting on more complexity than any model can hold. That, most of them will tell you, is the thing they love about it. Stand under a murmuration of starlings sometime. Really look at it. 100,000 animals moving as one. No leader, no plan, only each bird responding to the 7 birds nearest to it, following rules so simple that they produce something that looks like consciousness itself. The mathematics of it have been studied for decades. We still do not have a complete explanation for how they do it. Remember the pigeon we looked at near the beginning of this film? The bird on the sidewalk? The one we walked past without a thought? Look at it again. Those scales on the feet, those hollow bones, that wishbone, that 3-toed foot, that warm blood, those feathers, that magnetic sense that tells it where it is in the city without GPS. It has been a dinosaur for 150 million years. We simply never gave it the dignity of the word. The most ancient thing on most city streets is the pigeons, not the buildings, not the roads, not the humans, the pigeons. They carry the Mesozoic with them, folded into every feather and every hollow bone, walking among us on three-toed feet that have not changed in essential structure since the Jurassic. We often speak of extinction as an ending. The non-avian dinosaurs are gone. That is true. But the category itself, Dinosauria, is as alive as it has ever been. More species of dinosaur are alive today than were alive at any single moment in the Mesozoic. The asteroid was not an ending, it was an edit. Life has survived 5 mass extinction events. It will survive more. The forms it takes change, sometimes beyond recognition. But the thread continues. Dinosaurs walked through the Triassic-Jurassic extinction 200 million years ago and emerged stronger for it. They walked through the Jurassic into the Cretaceous, and when the Cretaceous ended, something they had become survived that too. There is something quietly extraordinary about living on a planet where the survivors of a mass extinction event wake you up every morning, where the heirs of the largest animals that ever walked on land nest in your trees and eat from your hand. We are not the dominant life form on this planet. We are guests in a story that started long before us. Every feather that falls is a message from the Jurassic. Every bird song is a language older than any human word. Every migration is a map drawn in genes that were written before this continent had its current shape. We live inside an ongoing biological inheritance that most of us have never been introduced to. This film is an introduction. Inside a bird egg at this moment, somewhere on every continent on Earth, a dinosaur is becoming. The next time you hear the first bird of the morning, before anything else has started, before the traffic, before the news, before the weight of everything human, that is the sound that was here before all of it, and will likely still be here after. One lineage, one thread. 230 million years of unbroken continuity through everything the Earth could throw at it. We found it again about 30 years ago in the rock of Liaoning province, in the bones of something that should have been called a bird and was called a dinosaur instead. Both words were right. Both were always right. What else, hiding in plain sight, are we still getting wrong? There is a lot more to find. The fossil beds are still producing. The geneticists are still running the experiments. Every year the picture gets sharper and stranger and more remarkable. That is what this channel is here for. If you want to keep going deeper, we have more waiting for you. If this film changed the way you see the birds outside your window, subscribe to Our World and Beyond, leave a thought in the comments, and look up more often as you go about your day. After all, you are living among dinosaurs.